A Whisper Through the Pantry Door, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Retirement Tea. The invitation had come on paper so thick and cream-coloured that Miss Marple had turned it over twice before reading it, half expecting a watermark of the sort one saw on wedding stationery. Mrs. Enid Trent requests the pleasure of your company at a small tea in honour of her retirement at Gossington Manor. 31 years, the note explained, as housekeeper to the Ashworth family, and now Mrs. Trent was to remove herself to a cottage near Much Benham with a niece and a fondness for canaries. Miss Marple had known Enid Trent since they were girls together at the vicarage school, and though their lives had gone in very different directions, one to a manor house below stairs, the other to a cottage above the vicarage garden, they had kept up a correspondence of the sort that consists chiefly of remarks about the weather and the iniquities of the younger generation. It seemed only right to attend. Gossington Manor stood some 4 miles from St. Mary Mead, a square Georgian house with a good deal of ivy and a reputation, locally, for being unlucky. Old Mrs. Ashworth had died there in peculiar circumstances some years before Miss Marple's time, and the present master, Colonel Rupert Ashworth, was said to be a man who kept his household on a tight rein, and his accounts tighter still. The taxi set Miss Marple down at 3:30, and she was shown through to the drawing-room by a manservant of exceptional smoothness, Simmons, the butler, a man whose movements had the quality of oil poured carefully from a jug, never a drop wasted, never a sound. He had been at Gossington 18 years, Miss Marple understood, and had about him the settled, unhurried authority of a man who has made himself indispensable by knowing precisely where everything is kept, and precisely who owes him a favour. The room was already half full. Colonel Ashworth stood by the fireplace, looking, as retired military men so often do at family gatherings, faintly out of place among the teacups, his moustache twitching with the effort of remembering which of his tenants' wives he was expected to greet by name. He caught sight of Miss Marple, and came forward with rather more warmth than she had anticipated. Miss Marple. Delighted, delighted. Enid tells me you've known her since you were girls together. Remarkable thing, that sort of friendship lasts a good deal longer than most of the fashionable sort in my experience. You'll have some of this seed cake. Coombs has been baking since Tuesday. I shouldn't wonder. Works herself into a positive state over these occasions, though I've told her often enough, it's only tea, not a regimental dinner. Miss Marple accepted the cake, and agreed that old friendships were a good deal better than new ones, and privately noted that the Colonel spoke of his cook with the easy, unthinking fondness of a man who has never once had cause to wonder what she thought of him in return. His son Gerald, a fair, restless young man of perhaps 26, hovered near the French windows, with the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to look at another person in the room. In this case, Miss Marple noted, a young housemaid clearing away a tray, a girl with dark hair and quick, anxious eyes, who was introduced, when introductions were made at all to the below-stairs staff, as Dorothy Pike, called Dolly. Miss Marple, who had watched a good many young men in a good many drawing-rooms over the years, contrived to look everywhere in a room except at the one person who mattered to them, thought this a very thorough piece of contriving indeed, and wondered, not for the last time that afternoon, what it must cost a young man to practice it so consistently under his own father's roof. There was, besides the family, a guest Miss Marple had not expected, a Mrs. Celia Vane, a handsome woman of perhaps 45, with a very correct county voice, and a habit of glancing at the door whenever it opened, as though she expected, and rather dreaded, someone in particular to come through it. She was staying at the manor, Colonel Ashworth explained, with the vague heartiness of a man repeating a story he has not fully absorbed himself, as the widow of an old brother officer, down from London to see about some family papers. "And this is Mrs. Coombs," said Mrs. Trent proudly, drawing forward a stout, red-faced woman in an apron who had clearly been persuaded out of the kitchen, only under considerable protest, our cook. 30 years at Gossington, if you can credit it, Jane, longer even than myself." Mrs. Ivy Coombs bobbed something between a curtsy and a nod, and said in a voice that carried more than she perhaps intended, 30 years, and I'll say this for it. I know where everybody is buried in this house. Begging your pardon, ma'am, for the expression." She laughed, but her eye, Miss Marple noticed, went not to Mrs. Trent as she said it, but to Simmons, standing very still by the sideboard with the teapot in his hand, and from Simmons it slid, just for a moment, to Mrs. Celia Vane. It was the smallest thing, a woman making an old joke at her own retirement tea for a friend. And yet Miss Marple, who had spent a long lifetime in a small village, learning that people's eyes go where their thoughts have already been, found herself remembering it rather more clearly than the excellent seed cake, or Mrs. Trent's account of her plans for canary breeding, or anything else said that afternoon. "You must come again before you leave for Much Benham, Enid," she said, as the tea drew to its close, and the shadows lengthened across the lawn. "We have hardly had a moment to talk properly." "I shall hold you to that, Jane." Mrs. Trent pressed her hand. "Though I don't mind telling you, there are one or two things in this house I shan't be sorry to leave behind." 30 years is a long time to watch people not say what they mean. It was said lightly, with the small, satisfied malice of a woman about to be free of a place, and Miss Marple pressed her friend's hand and said only that people so rarely did say what they meant, in her experience, that one learned to be grateful for the rare occasions when they did. She was shown out, at her own request, through the servants' passage rather than across the gravel drive, which her shoes disliked exceedingly, and it was a route that took her past the open door of the kitchen, where Mrs. Coombs could be heard directing the washing up of the tea things, with a vigour quite undiminished by an afternoon's baking, and past the foot of a narrow back staircase that rose, steep and uncarpeted, toward the upper floors. Miss Marple, pausing a moment to allow a maid with a laden tray to pass, rested her gloved hand quite naturally upon the polished newel post at the stairs' foot, and noticed, without at that moment attaching to it any particular significance, a faint dusting of something pale and fine caught in the grain of the wood. Flour, she supposed, from the day's baking, tracked about the house, as flour so often was in a kitchen given over to seed cakes and scones. It was only later, a very little later, as it turned out, that she would remember the flour, and Mrs. Coombs's glance, and Mrs. Trent's tired little confidence, and understand that Gossington Manor had, in its quiet Georgian way, been trying to tell her something all afternoon. Chapter 2. A Body at the Foot of the Stairs. The telephone rang at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning, at the unfashionable hour of 7:30, and it was Enid Trent's voice, thin and shaking, that came down the line. "Jane, Jane, you must come. It's Mrs. Coombs. She's dead. They found her at the bottom of the back stairs not an hour ago, and Constable Prentice is saying it was a fall. But Jane, I was the last up last night, and I know that pantry door was—" The line crackled, and Mrs. Trent's voice was cut off by another, brisker, official-sounding, informing whoever was listening that the doctor had been sent for, and no one was to touch anything. Miss Marple did not, as a rule, insert herself where she was not wanted, but an old friend in distress, and a house she had visited only the day before, seemed sufficient reason to put on her coat and take the 11 o'clock bus. She found Gossington Manor in the peculiar hush that follows sudden death, in a household still arranging its face for visitors. Constable Prentice, a large, unimaginative young man whom Miss Marple remembered as a rather slow pupil at Sunday school some 15 years before, was standing at the foot of the back stairs with his notebook out, looking pleased with the tidiness of his own conclusions. "Nasty tumble. That's all it is, miss. Mrs. Trent will have it there's something queer about it, but there generally is, when a body goes sudden, if you ask them that knew her. Mrs. Coombs must have come down for something in the small hours, flour or the like, for she'd flour on her hands and her apron both, missed her footing in the dark, and there you are." Doctor's coming to confirm it. But he said as much already on the telephone. Flour on her hands, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How very interesting, Constable. And was there flour anywhere else, I wonder? On the stairs themselves, or the banister? Prentice consulted his notebook with the air of a man humouring an elderly lady. Can't say as I looked particular close at the banister, miss. Don't see as it signifies. No, said Miss Marple. No, I don't suppose it would signify to most people at all. The house itself, when Miss Marple was admitted, wore the strange, suspended air of a place in which the ordinary business of living has been abruptly halted, without anyone quite knowing how to resume it. A housemaid stood weeping quietly in the hall with a duster still in her hand, as though she had been overtaken by the news in the very act of polishing the hall table, and had not since found the will to set the duster down. Mrs. Trent herself, when Miss Marple found her, was sitting very upright in a hard chair in the housekeeper's room, with her hands folded in her lap, in the particular rigid stillness of a woman holding herself together by main force. I keep thinking, Jane, that if I had only gone down myself when I heard something in the night, instead of telling myself it was only the house settling, as houses will. She broke off, and Miss Marple took her hand and said gently that a house settling in the night sounded exactly like a house settling in the night, and that no one of sense blamed themselves for failing to distinguish it from anything worse, and that they had far better turn their minds to practical matters, of which there would shortly be a great many requiring Mrs. Trent's competent attention. She was permitted, Mrs. Trent's distress and Miss Marple's evident respectability between them opening doors that might otherwise have stayed shut, to view the body before it was moved, laid at the foot of the narrow back staircase that ran from the first-floor linen room down past the still room to the kitchen passage. Mrs. Coombs lay as though she had pitched forward all at once, one arm flung out, her cap knocked from her grey head, and there was indeed a fine dusting of flour across the knuckles of both hands, and a scattering of it too, on the stone flags around her, as though a small paper bag had burst in the fall. But it was the pantry, when Miss Marple was shown to it a few minutes later. A stone-floored room at the foot of the stairs, lined with jars and crocks, where the household stores were kept under, Mrs. Trent explained, Mrs. Coombs's own particular and jealous supervision. That gave Miss Marple her first small, quiet jolt of interest. The pantry door stood ajar now, propped by a policeman's boot. But the bolt on the inside, a heavy iron thing installed some years before, after an incident of pilfering, hung loose and undamaged, and Mrs. Trent, wringing her hands by the doorway, said in a hushed voice, "That's the thing of it, Jane. I came down at 6, same as always, and that door was bolted fast from the inside. I had to send for Simmons to force it before ever we knew about poor Ivy on the stairs at all. Bolted from the inside, and her lying dead outside it. How does a body manage that, I should like to know?" Miss Marple looked at the bolt and at the small barred window above the flour bin, which stood a little open, and said nothing at all for a long moment. She noted the flour bin itself, a large enamel container with a hinged lid, standing directly beneath the window, and the dusting of white across its surface, disturbed in a way that suggested it had been recently opened and closed again in some haste. She noted, too, that the pantry's single door gave onto the passage at the foot of the back stairs, so that a person locked within it would be, in the most literal sense, sealed away from the very spot where her body was afterward discovered, a circumstance that struck Miss Marple as considerably more interesting than tragic, however the constable chose to read it. "It is a very small room to have caused so large a puzzle," she observed, half to herself. "And yet I think, Enid, that small rooms very often do. One is inclined to overlook them, precisely because they seem to matter so little beside a staircase and a body." "How indeed?" she said at last, gently. "I think, Enid, before the doctor comes, I should very much like to see that window from the outside." Chapter 3. The Flower on the Banister. The garden beneath the pantry window was a strip of hard-packed earth between the house wall and a low box hedge, used, Mrs. Trent explained, for the emptying of ash and the occasional airing of rugs, and not a place anyone had cause to walk after dark. Miss Marple, moving along it with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had spent a great many years observing the habits of birds and gossips alike, found what she had rather expected to find, and was still faintly gratified to find it. 2 shallow depressions in the soft earth directly below the window, some 18 inches apart, of a size and shape that might have been made by the toes of a pair of boots, and, caught on a thorn of the box hedge at exactly shoulder height for a person standing there, a single thread of dark worsted. She did not touch the thread. She stood looking at it for some time, turning over in her mind the various persons in the household who might own a coat of dark worsted, which description, she reflected with some inward dissatisfaction, could be made to fit very nearly every man on the premises, from the colonel down to the boy who cleaned the boots, and was consequently a good deal less useful as a clue than as a confirmation of something she had already begun, in the most tentative way, to suspect. What mattered rather more than the thread's colour was its height upon the hedge, shoulder height for a person of no more than middling stature, standing quite still, as one might stand while working carefully at a window catch or a bolt with both hands occupied, rather than passing hurriedly by on some other errand. She went back into the house by the kitchen door, where she found Simmons directing 2 frightened maids in the laying of dust sheets over the drawing-room furniture, in preparation, he said, for the disruption that must inevitably follow. "A very shocking business, Simmons," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You must have known Mrs. Coombs a great many years." 18 years, madam, since I came to Gossington. Mrs. Coombs was cook here a good deal longer than that." His voice was perfectly smooth, perfectly correct, and told Miss Marple absolutely nothing whatever, which she found, in its way, quite as informative as if it had told her a great deal. "And the pantry window, is it usually left ajar overnight?" "Mrs. Coombs was most particular about ventilation for the stores, madam, on account of the damp. It is generally left open some 3 or 4 inches, summer and winter alike." He said this without the smallest hesitation, and Miss Marple thought that a man less well prepared with an answer might have paused, even for a moment, to wonder why an elderly lady visiting for a retirement tea should be asking him about pantry windows the morning after a death. It was, she reflected, precisely the trouble with people whose manners were too perfect. One could never tell whether their composure sprang from an easy conscience or a very carefully rehearsed one, and only time, and further small questions asked in an unthreatening voice, would ever tell the two apart. "You keep the household accounts yourself, I understand, along with the cellar," she added, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. "It must be a heavy responsibility in a house of this size." "I have always found order its own reward, madam," Simmons said, and turned to instruct one of the maids on the proper folding of a dust sheet in a manner that made it perfectly clear the conversation, so far as he was concerned, had concluded. She went up, then by the back stairs themselves, moving slowly, one gloved hand resting on the banister rail as an elderly lady climbing stairs might naturally do, and stopped, on the half landing between the first floor and the linen room, where her hand encountered a faint but unmistakable roughness on the polished wood, the same fine white dust she had noticed the day before, on her way out to the taxi, quite 2 floors above the pantry and the kitchen passage where the flour was properly kept. It was, she reflected, climbing on with the dust now firmly fixed in her mind, alongside the thread on the box hedge, the 2 depressions in the earth, and Mrs. Coombs's curious, considering glance at the retirement tea, really a very great deal of flour to have found its way about the house in the space of one evening, considering that a person falling down a single flight of stairs from the linen room to the kitchen passage could hardly be expected to have scattered it 2 stories higher on her way up. Unless, of course, she reflected further, standing quite still on the half landing, with the low afternoon sun coming through a narrow window, Mrs. Coombs had not fallen from the linen room at all, unless she had been carried, or had climbed, unwillingly, or under some pretext, a good deal higher than that, and had come down again by a route rather more sudden than the stairs were designed for. It was not, Miss Marple told herself, going down again to find Mrs. Trent, a comfortable thought to be having in a house where one had so recently taken tea. But then, murder, and she was becoming quite certain now that it was murder she was having thoughts about, very rarely was comfortable, however politely it dressed itself up. She paused a moment at the foot of the main staircase to collect herself, for it would not do, she felt, to arrive in Mrs. Trent's sitting room, wearing the expression of a woman who has just concluded that a death pronounced misadventure was nothing of the sort. And it took her a full minute of contemplating a rather ordinary hunting print on the landing wall before she felt her face composed enough to be trusted with company again. There was, she thought, a particular discipline required of a woman in her position, to go on thinking the most alarming thoughts imaginable behind a countenance of perfect placidity, dispensing tea and sympathy in exactly equal measure, while privately assembling, fact by small fact, an account of a murder that everyone else in the house had already agreed to call an accident. Chapter 4. Below Stairs. Whispers Dr. Haydock's inquest verdict, delivered the following week with the caution proper to a man who did not care to commit himself further than the evidence strictly required, was death by misadventure, consistent with a fall, though he had noted, in his report, a certain bruising about the shoulders that sat oddly with a simple tumble down a single flight, and had said as much, privately, to Miss Marple over a glass of sherry, with the air of a man raising an eyebrow he did not wish officially recorded. Miss Marple, walking home from the surgery in the mild autumn dusk, reflected that a doctor's raised eyebrow, though it carried no legal weight whatever, was very often a good deal more reliable than a coroner's jury, composed as such juries generally were of respectable local tradesmen, anxious above all things to return to their shops with the least possible delay, and disinclined, on the whole, to trouble themselves with bruising that might, after all, be accounted for by a fall against a newel post quite as easily as by anything more sinister. The household, meanwhile, had settled into the particular watchfulness of servants who know that a death in the family, however explained, has set everyone privately totting up old grievances against everyone else. Mrs. Trent, delaying her retirement out of what she called simple decency, though Miss Marple suspected it was quite as much curiosity, proved a willing and detailed source of below-stairs history, delivered over the teapot, in the housekeeper's own small sitting-room. "It's not for me to say a word against the dead," Mrs. Trent began, in the tone of a woman about to say a good many, but Ivy Coombs could hold a grudge, the way other women hold babies, tender as anything, and never willing to put it down. There was bad blood between her and Simmons going back years, though what started it I never rightly knew. She'd make remarks, you understand, Jane, nothing a body could put a finger on, but sharp little things about people who thought themselves above their station, and knowing where bodies were buried, and Simmons would go very still and very smooth, the way he does, and change the subject to the wine cellar. "The wine cellar," Miss Marple repeated. "Is that his particular charge? His, and no one else's. Colonel Ashworth trusts him entire with the stores and the accounts both, has done for years. Ivy used to say it was a fine thing to be trusted so entire that nobody thought to check the sums." Mrs. Trent poured more tea with the satisfaction of a woman delivering a point she had been saving. "And then there's Dolly Pike. Poor child, though I'd not have you think ill of her. She's a good little worker, whatever else she may be up to on the side." "Up to?" Mrs. Trent lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the room. "Master Gerald and that girl Jane, thick as thieves this past 6 months, meeting of an evening in the shrubbery, and once, I'll say this only to you, I came upon them in the linen room itself, very late, and neither of them with a satisfactory account of what they were doing there. Ivy knew of it too, disapproved most fiercely, said it would come to no good, a housemaid setting her cap at the young master, and threatened more than once to speak to the colonel of it if it didn't stop. And did it stop? It did not, said Mrs. Trent grimly. If anything, Jane, I believe matters between them had gone a good deal further than an evening in the shrubbery. Miss Marple considered the linen room, one floor above the half-landing where she had found the flower dust, and thought of Gerald Ashworth's careful stillness at the retirement tea, his eyes sliding always toward a dark-haired girl clearing a tea tray, and wondered whether a threat to speak to the colonel might weigh rather more heavily on a young man's mind and a young woman's future than anyone below stairs had troubled to imagine. "And Mrs. Vane?" she asked. "The lady staying in the house. How does she come into all this? I understood she was down about some family papers." Mrs. Trent's face took on the particular blankness of a servant declining, even to an old friend, to speculate about her betters. "And yet, it's a curious thing you should ask, Jane," she said slowly. "Ivy took one look at that lady the day she arrived, a fortnight back, and went the colour of a plucked chicken, and wouldn't say why, only that she'd seen that face somewhere it oughtn't to be. I thought it was one of her fancies. I'm not so sure now." "Did Mrs. Coombs say nothing further about it in the days before she died? No hint of where she might have seen the lady before? Only that it troubled her enough to lose her sleep over it, for I heard her myself, twice, moving about the kitchen at an hour when a woman of her age and habits ought properly to have been abed. I asked her once what ailed her, and she said only that some faces were like old debts. You thought they'd been settled and forgotten, and then one turned up on your very doorstep wanting paying after all. I didn't understand her at the time, Jane, and I own I'm not sure I understand her now, except that it seems a queer thing for a woman to say about a guest she'd never so much as been introduced to." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the small, precise click of a woman who has just been handed the last piece of a pattern she had been assembling for some days, and found that it did not, quite yet, tell her who had killed Ivy Coombs, but told her very clearly indeed that at Gossington Manor everyone below stairs, and one or two above them, had known a good deal more than they had troubled to say. Chapter 5. The Butler's Ledger. The library at Gossington was a long, low-ceilinged room, smelling of leather and pipe tobacco, its shelves given over rather more to sporting almanacs and regimental histories than to literature. And it was here, among the mounted fox masks and a faded photograph of a polo team, long since scattered to the four corners of the empire, that Miss Marple found her opportunity. It was Colonel Ashworth himself, cornered by Miss Marple in the library, on the pretext of returning a book borrowed by his late wife some years before, who supplied the next thread, though he did not know he was supplying anything at all. "Damned unsettling business," he said, pouring himself a whisky rather earlier in the afternoon than was strictly his habit. "Prentice tells me it's closed, misadventure, and I'm bound to be glad of it, for the family's sake. But I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, it's put me in an awkward spot over the household accounts. Coombs kept the kitchen books, you understand. Stores, wages for the kitchen girls, that sort of thing. And now I find, going through them since her death, that the figures for the last 12 months don't square with what Simmons has been drawing for the cellar. Nothing dramatic, a few pounds here and there. But it's there, plain as you like, once you look." "How very troubling, Colonel. Had Mrs. Coombs noticed it herself, do you think? She'd said something to me, matter of fact, not a fortnight before she died. Asked me straight out whether I'd authorized an increase in the wine merchant's account, which I hadn't, and said she'd have a word with Simmons about his sums before troubling me with it formally. I told her not to make a fuss over a few pounds. I wish to God now I'd asked her more." He drank rather more of the whisky than the hour warranted. "You don't suppose—" No, it's a monstrous thought that a man would kill over the price of a few bottles of port. People have killed for a good deal less than that, Colonel, when it was not truly the port at stake, but their whole position and character," Miss Marple said gently. "A man who has built 18 years of trust on being the sort of person who is never checked, might value that trust rather more than the sum of money itself, and fear its loss rather more than most of us would fear losing the money. She left the Colonel to his whiskey and his uncomfortable arithmetic, and made her way, by a route that took her past the pantry once more, to the small room off the servants' hall where the household account books were kept in a locked cupboard, to which, Mrs. Trent had mentioned, only Simmons and the Colonel held keys. The cupboard being locked was no great obstacle to observation, however, for Simmons himself was within the servants' hall at that moment, engaged in the sort of ostentatious tidiness that Miss Marple had long ago learned to recognize as the occupation of a man whose mind was very much elsewhere. He was refolding, with great precision, a stack of linen napkins that did not, on close inspection, need refolding at all. "I understand the Colonel has found some little confusion in the cellar accounts, Mr. Simmons," Miss Marple said, settling herself, uninvited, into the one comfortable chair the room possessed. "How very tiresome for you, after so many years of managing everything so well." The napkins in Simmons's hands went still for perhaps a second and a half, no more, before resuming their careful folding. "A clerical matter, madam, I have no doubt. These things arise from time to time in any large household." Mrs. Coombs was not, if I may say so without disrespect to the dead, always entirely accurate in her own bookkeeping. She seems to have been accurate enough to notice a discrepancy, however, and to have said she meant to have a word with you about it. Miss Marple said this with the mild, unthreatening interest of an old lady making conversation, and watched Simmons's face with the close attention she generally reserved for the more complicated behavior of garden birds. "I could not say what Mrs. Coombs may have intended, madam. She did not, in the event, have the opportunity to raise the matter with me before her unfortunate accident." He set the last napkin on the pile with a finality that closed the subject as neatly as the pantry bolt had once closed the pantry, and turned to the business of the silver, laid out on the sideboard in readiness for its weekly cleaning, with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything he touched. Miss Marple, watching him check each fork against a list before setting it out for the boy to polish, thought that here was a man who had made a religion of exactness, precisely because exactness, so relentlessly maintained over 18 years, had become the whole of his claim upon the world's trust, and that a man who had built his entire position upon never once being found wanting in a small particular might go to very great lengths indeed, rather than be found wanting in a large one. "You have a great gift for order, Mr. Simmons," she said, rising to take her leave. "I confess, I find it quite restful merely to watch." "One does one's best, madam," he said, and the smoothness of it, Miss Marple reflected, walking away down the passage, was really quite remarkable, considering that the man delivering it must have known, by that time, that his sums no longer added up to anyone's satisfaction but his own. Miss Marple, rising to take her leave, reflected that a man's before her unfortunate accident could be either the most natural phrase in the world, or a very carefully chosen one indeed, and that she had not yet decided which, though she was beginning, very quietly, to have her suspicions. Chapter 6. The Scullery Maid's Secret. The scullery at Gossington was a cold, stone-flagged room at the very back of the house, smelling of soda and wet metal, and it was here, among a battery of copper pans hung in diminishing order of size along the wall, that Miss Marple found the last of her principal witnesses. Dolly Pike found scouring pots in the scullery with a violence rather beyond what the pots strictly required, was not, at first, inclined to talk to a strange elderly lady about anything whatever, and Miss Marple, who understood a good deal about frightened young women, did not press her directly, but instead admired, at some length and with perfect sincerity, the girl's evident skill with a copper pan, until Dolly's shoulders came down some half an inch from around her ears. "You'll have heard, I expect," Dolly said at last, not looking up, "that Mrs. Coombs didn't approve of me and Master Gerald. Everyone's heard it. I suppose you think, same as the rest, that I'd cause to wish her out of the way. I think nothing of the kind, my dear, until I have some reason to, Miss Marple said comfortably. But I should be glad to hear it from you, rather than from Mrs. Trent's account of it, if you don't object. It came out then, in the halting, half-defiant way of a story too long kept secret, that Gerald Ashworth had asked her to marry him in the spring, and meant it, whatever his father might say to a housemaid for a daughter-in-law. That Mrs. Coombs, who had known Dolly's mother in service years before and felt some odd, proprietary responsibility for the girl, had taken violently against the match, not from malice, Dolly insisted, but from a conviction that no good ever came of a girl reaching above her station, and had threatened, more than once, to tell the Colonel herself if Dolly did not end it. The night she died, Dolly said, twisting the dishcloth in her hands. She come to me, very late, must have been past midnight, and says she's decided. She's going to speak to the Colonel in the morning, whatever I say to stop her, and I begged her not to, and she went off toward the back stairs, saying she needed a word with someone first. I didn't ask who. I was that upset, and that's the last I saw of her living. I never went near those stairs myself. I swear it. But I know how it looks, with the flower and all, seeing as I'd been up in the linen room that same night, same as Mrs. Trent will have told you. Did you see anyone else about, on your own way to the linen room or back from it? Dolly hesitated, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she meant not to answer at all. I thought I heard Mr. Simmons on the back stairs, she said finally low, only I couldn't swear to it, and I didn't think anything of it at the time, him being about the house at all hours checking the doors were locked, same as always. It's only since I've had time to think on it. And has anyone else asked you these questions, Dolly? The constable, perhaps? He asked was I out of my bed, and I said no, seeing as, the girl flushed scarlet, seeing as I didn't want it known where I truly was, on account of Master Gerald. I'm not proud of the lie, but I'll not have his name dragged into an inquest for want of a better one. Miss Marple, who had heard a very great many young women in a very great many kitchens over the years, explain away small deceptions in the name of protecting someone they loved, thought that Dolly Pike's account had the particular, unpolished shape of the truth about it, the truth being, in her long experience, generally a good deal less tidy than a well-rehearsed lie, and thought too, with some sympathy, of a girl of perhaps 20, facing an inquest, a disapproving household, and now the added burden of having placed, however unwittingly, the butler on the back stairs at the very hour Ivy Coombs had gone up them for the last time. You mustn't fret yourself into believing that a small lie told for love makes you a suspect in a large matter, Dolly. I have found, over a good many years, that the two things generally sit at quite opposite ends of a person's character, whatever a policeman in a hurry may be inclined to think. She patted the girl's reddened hand, and Dolly, unused to kindness from a stranger of Miss Marple's evident quality, blinked rather hard and returned, with renewed vigor, to her pots. You've been very good to listen, ma'am, and not to look at me the way the constable did, like I'd already as good as done it, Dolly said, twisting the dishcloth once more. It's a hard thing, being the one everyone finds it easiest to suspect, just because you've less standing in the house than the rest, and no one troubles to think you might have feelings to be hurt by it, same as a lady would. I think you have a good deal more sense and a good deal more honesty than most people have troubled to notice, Dolly, and I should not be at all surprised if that proved the more valuable inheritance in the end. Miss Marple gathered her gloves. Thank you, my dear, she said, rising. I think you have been a great deal more help than you know, and I think, too, that you need not be quite so afraid as you have been. But I should not, if I were you, mention to anyone at all what you have just told me about Mr. Simmons. Not yet. Not until I have had rather more time to think about pantry doors. Chapter 7. The guest who wasn't it remained to account for Mrs. Celia Vane, And here Miss Marple found herself obliged, for want of below-stairs information, to fall back on a resource a good deal more reliable in her experience than any single witness: the accumulated, cross-referenced memory of a great many elderly women who had, over a great many years, made it their unhurried business to remember faces. It was a method Miss Marple had employed to good effect on more than one previous occasion, and she was not in the least ashamed of it, holding as she did the private conviction that a network of retired governesses, spinster cousins, and clergymen's widows, properly consulted, could generally produce more reliable information about a person's true history than any number of official inquiries, precisely because such women had spent their lives noticing things that officialdom considered beneath its notice. A letter to her friend in London, a retired schoolmistress with a taste for genealogy, and an inexhaustible correspondence with women very like herself, scattered across the shires, produced, within 4 days, a reply that Miss Marple read twice over her breakfast tea with an expression of the deepest satisfaction. Mrs. Celia Vane, it transpired, was indeed a widow, and had indeed been married to an officer who had known Colonel Ashworth in India, but she had not always been Mrs. Vane. Some 15 years before, under the name of Rose Tranter, she had been employed as a kitchen maid at a house in Hampshire, where a Mr. Simmons had also, briefly, been in service as an under-butler, and had left that position rather suddenly, under a cloud involving the disappearance of a quantity of household silver, a theft for which Rose Tranter had been dismissed without a character, and for which Miss Marple's correspondent noted with the particular relish of a woman who has run a piece of scandal to earth after 30 years, the under-butler in question had never once been suspected at all. Armed with this, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Vane in the small morning room where she had taken to sitting alone a good deal since Mrs. Coombs's death, and found her a good deal less composed, on closer acquaintance, than her correct county voice suggested. "I think, Mrs. Vane, or should I say, Miss Tranter, that we might speak rather more frankly than we have done," Miss Marple said, seating herself without invitation. "I have no wish to cause you distress, and very little interest in an old matter of household silver, 15 years dead. But a woman has been killed in this house, and I think you know a good deal more about why than you have troubled to tell the constable." The colour left Mrs. Vane's face entirely, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then, with the particular relief of someone who has carried a secret a good deal further than they wished to, she put her face in her hands and talked. She had come to Gossington, she admitted, not for family papers at all, but to find Simmons, to confront the man whose silence, 15 years before, had let her take the blame for a theft that had, in fact, been entirely his doing, and to demand, at long last, some recompense for a ruined character and 15 years of reduced circumstances. She had written to him under an assumed name to secure the invitation through the Colonel, an old acquaintance of her late husband's, and had meant, before Ivy Coombs's death threw the whole household into disorder, to have the matter out with Simmons privately, and had said as much to him, in fact, on the very afternoon of the retirement tea, in a brief and bitter exchange in the passage outside the drawing-room. "He told me I was mad to think anyone would believe a dismissed kitchen-maid's word against an 18-year butler's, and that I had better leave quietly, or find myself in a good deal more trouble than I'd bargained for," Mrs. Vane said, her hands twisting in her lap. "I told him I meant to have my character back if it took me the rest of my life, and I did not care what trouble he threatened me with. I have thought since that it was a foolish thing to say to a man capable of what he proved capable of, but I did not know that then, Miss Marple. I only knew I was tired of 15 years of being the woman who was dismissed without a character, while the man who truly took that silver went on serving port to a colonel who trusted him absolutely. Ivy Coombs recognized me," she said low. "I saw it in her face at the tea. She'd known me at that other house years back, before ever I came here as Rose Tranter, though I'd hoped 15 years and a different name might spare me that at least. I don't know what she meant to do about it. I never had the chance to ask her. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, whatever else I am, I never touched that woman, and if she is dead because of what she recognized in my face at that tea, then I think you had better look a good deal harder at the man who had every reason in the world to want neither of us ever say a word." Mrs. Vane looked up at her then with the particular exhausted gratitude of a woman who has told a secret carried too long alone, and asked, in a voice still not quite steady, whether she must now tell the inspector all of it. The false name, the letter, the 15 years of grievance nursed in private lodgings on a widow's insufficient pension. "I think you must, Mrs. Vane, and I think, too, that you will find it a good deal less dreadful in the telling than you have imagined it these 2 weeks past. A secret carried alone has a way of growing a great deal larger in the dark than it ever proves to be once it is brought out and looked at plainly, in company. I have found that true of nearly every secret I have ever had occasion to examine, and I have examined, over the years, a very great many." "I had already begun to, Mrs. Vane," said Miss Marple gently. "I had already begun to." Chapter 8. Old Grudges Resurface. The shrubbery at Gossington had been laid out, some 50 years before, in the fashionable manner of winding paths and ornamental shrubs, designed to afford a series of small, private surprises to a visitor strolling its length, and Miss Marple, who had a countrywoman's fondness for a well-kept garden whatever its original purpose, found it a pleasant enough place to walk while she turned over the morning's revelations in her mind. It was a curious thing, Miss Marple reflected, walking back through the shrubbery toward the house, with the low autumn sun slanting gold through the last of the leaves. How very much an old grudge came to resemble, over enough years, a plant left too long untended in a garden corner, quiet, unremarked, apparently dormant, and then, given the smallest disturbance of soil, astonishingly, dangerously alive. Simmons's grudge, if grudge it could be called, against exposure, had lain dormant for 15 years, since a Hampshire household silver theft had been quietly laid at the door of an under-parlour maid too junior and too frightened to defend herself, while the under-butler responsible had gone on, unblemished, to Gossington Manor and 18 years of unimpeachable service. It had lain dormant, Miss Marple thought, right up until 2 things had happened within the same fortnight. Ivy Coombs, cook of 30 years' standing, had begun asking pointed questions about the cellar accounts, and Rose Tranter, dismissed maid of 15 years' standing, had walked back into his life, wearing another woman's name and an old debt he had never expected to be called upon to pay. Either threat alone, Miss Marple suspected, a clever man might have managed. A little more care with the ledger, a quiet payment to buy Rose Tranter's silence, or her further disgrace if payment failed. But the two together, arriving within days of each other, must have seemed to a man whose entire character rested on 18 years of being trusted absolutely, like a door closing on every side of a room at once. She found Mrs. Trent in the housekeeper's sitting room, still delaying her departure for Much Benham, and put the question to her directly, in the plain, unhurried way she generally reserved for matters she had already very largely settled in her own mind. "Enid, I want you to think very carefully. On the night Mrs. Coombs died, you said you were the last one up, and that you found the pantry bolted from the inside the next morning. But who, besides yourself and Mrs. Coombs, generally goes about the house checking that the doors and windows are secured, last thing at night?" "Why, Simmons, always," Mrs. Trent said, without hesitation. "Has done every night these 18 years, regular as the church clock. Goes round after the family's retired, checks every window and every bolt himself. Won't leave it to the girls. Says it's the one duty he'll not delegate to anyone. I heard him on his rounds that very night. Matter of fact, some little while after I'd gone up myself. Heard his step on the back stairs. quite distinct, for he has a particular tread, heavier on the left foot on account of an old injury, so cook always said, though I never noticed it myself till she pointed it out. And would he, in the ordinary way of his rounds, have occasion to pass the linen room, a floor above the pantry, every night of his life, Jane, on his way to check the box-room window at the top of the back stairs? It's the last stop on his round, before he comes down again to bed. And has he ever, in 18 years, missed a night of it, or asked another to do it in his place? Never once that I can recall, and I've remarked on it myself, more than once, as a positive fault in a man who might do with a night off now and again like anyone else. He'd say only that a house left unchecked one night was a house asking to be robbed, and that he'd not have it said of Gossington that its butler grew careless in his old age. Miss Marple thought that a man so very insistent upon his own indispensability had perhaps protested a shade too much, over a good many years, for it to have been nothing more than conscientiousness, and that a habit maintained with such iron regularity might serve a man quite as well for concealing an opportunity as for demonstrating his virtue. Miss Marple sat for a moment in perfect stillness, the last piece of the pattern settling into place with the small, satisfying click of a jigsaw completed. A man who knew, better than anyone alive in that house, exactly which stairs would be empty at exactly which hour of the night, who knew that Ivy Coombs, restless and resolved to speak to the Colonel in the morning, was very likely to be found somewhere about the house rather than safely asleep, who knew, above all, precisely how a bolt looked when thrown from the inside of a door, and precisely how it might be made to look that way from the outside, by a man patient enough and familiar enough with the mechanism to manage it through a window left conveniently ajar for the ventilation of the stores. Mrs. Trent looked at her with something between alarm and awe. "You don't mean to tell me it was Simmons all along, Jane? Simmons, that I've trusted with the household keys these 18 years, same as the Colonel himself? I mean to tell you nothing at all yet, Enid, beyond what the facts themselves will presently tell an inspector a good deal more qualified than I am to act upon them. But I will say this much. The trouble with trusting a man for 18 years, precisely because he has never once given anyone cause to doubt him, is that one forgets to ask what such a man might do, should the day ever come when doubt could no longer be avoided. I think, Enid, Miss Marple said, rising, that it is time I had a word with Inspector Foley after all, and I think, too, that we shall want Simmons present when I have it, though he must not, on any account, be told in advance precisely what it is I mean to say." Chapter 9. The Locked Pantry. He arrived, that same afternoon, in a small dusty car that announced itself a good half-mile off by the racket of its engine on the gravel drive, and proved, to Miss Marple's considerable relief, a good deal less wedded to Constable Prentice's tidy verdict than she had feared a county inspector, jealous of the local man's territory, might naturally be. Inspector Foley, summoned from the county town at Miss Marple's quiet insistence, and Colonel Ashworth's rather more agitated one, proved a sensible man with the useful habit of listening a great deal before he spoke, and by the time Miss Marple had laid before him the flour on the banister, 2 floors above the pantry, the depressions in the earth beneath the window, with the single thread of dark worsted caught upon the hedge, Dolly Pike's account of a heavy, uneven tread on the back stairs at an hour when the girl swore she herself had never left the linen room, and the discrepancy in the cellar accounts that gave a trusted servant of 18 years a very sudden and very pressing reason to silence 2 women in the same fortnight. By the time all this was laid out, in the plain, unemphatic order in which Miss Marple generally preferred to lay such things, Inspector Foley was disposed to agree that the pantry bolt wanted a closer look than Constable Prentice had given it. "The difficulty, as I see it, Miss Marple," he said, turning the heavy iron bolt over in his hands where it had been unscrewed, at his direction from the pantry door, "is proving it. A clever man, with 18 years' knowledge of a house, doesn't generally leave the sort of evidence a jury can put its finger on. Flour on a banister and a footprint in soft earth are the sort of thing a defending counsel makes very short work of indeed. I quite agree, Inspector, which is why I do not think we ought to rely upon them alone, Miss Marple said. But a bolt of this kind, thrown from outside a closed door through a gap of no more than a few inches, the window above the flour bin, you will recall, was found some 3 or 4 inches open, which Simmons himself assured me was Mrs. Coombs's own arrangement for the ventilation of the stores. Such a thing is not, I think, done with the fingers alone. It wants some sort of tool, a cord perhaps, looped about the bolt handle and drawn taut through the window from outside, or a thin rod of some kind to push it home. And a tool of that sort, Inspector, used in a hurry, on a night when a man had just done something very much worse a floor above. Such a tool is not always as carefully disposed of afterward as its user might wish, particularly if he believed, as I think Simmons very reasonably believed, that no one would trouble to look for it at all, once the constable had pronounced the whole matter a simple fall. It was Foley's own sergeant, dispatched to search the small gardener's shed, where Simmons kept, among other things, the twine and canes used for the kitchen garden, who found it within the hour. A length of stout garden twine, some 18 inches of it, with a loop worked into one end of a size to slip neatly over an iron bolt handle, coiled and pushed to the back of a drawer behind a ball of ordinary twine, in the particular way, Miss Marple observed when it was shown to her, that a careful man disposes of a thing he cannot quite bring himself to burn outright, telling himself he will do so tomorrow, and then finding, as such men generally do, that tomorrow arrives with the thing still undestroyed. "It is a very small piece of string, Inspector," Miss Marple said, "but I think you will find, when it is examined properly, that the fibres correspond to those caught on the pantry bolt itself, where twine drawn swiftly and forcefully through a metal loop very often leaves some trace of itself behind. And I think, too, that a man confronted with his own twine, in his own drawer, worked into a loop for no gardening purpose whatever, is a good deal more likely to talk than a man merely confronted with flour on a banister." Foley turned the loop of twine over once more in his hands, holding it to the light from the window, and admitted that he had seen a good many confessions come apart on a good deal less than what Miss Marple had just laid before him, and a good many convictions secured on rather more circumstantial ground than a garden shed and a pantry bolt, provided the fibres, when properly examined, bore out what she had predicted of them. He sent the twine off that same afternoon, by his sergeant on a motorcycle, to the county forensic office, with instructions that the matter be treated as urgent, and settled himself, with Miss Marple's evident approval, to wait upon the result, with what patience the two of them could muster between them. "There is one thing more, Inspector, which I think you will want to bear in mind when the report comes back," Miss Marple added, as they waited. "A bolt thrown from outside, by means of a looped cord drawn through a narrow gap, requires a certain steadiness of hand and a certain familiarity with the mechanism, gained, I should think, only by a man who has closed and opened that very bolt himself, from the inside, a very great many times before, which is to say, a man whose nightly rounds had made him more intimate with the workings of that particular pantry door than anyone else in the household, the cook herself not excepted. You've thought this through very thoroughly, Miss Marple. I have had a great deal of practice, thinking through very ordinary things very thoroughly, Inspector. It is, I find, the chief occupation left to an elderly woman in a small village, and I have come to believe it a good deal more useful than it is generally given credit for. Chapter 10. A Village Comparison. The little sitting room Mrs. Trent had lent them looked out over the kitchen garden, and Miss Marple, glancing through the window at the very shed where the fatal twine had lain hidden for some 10 days, thought there was something almost too neat, too fitting, in a murder whose undoing had come from so humble and domestic a source as a gardener's drawer, and reflected that murder in a great house, for all its trappings of silver and seed cake, was generally undone in the end by precisely such humble and domestic things, rather than by anything so grand as a smoking pistol or a torn will. It was while they waited, for Inspector Foley wished to examine the twine properly before confronting anyone, and had asked Miss Marple, with the courtesy of a man who had learned, over the course of the afternoon, to value her opinion rather more than he had expected to at its outset, whether she had any thoughts on how Simmons might best be brought to admit what the evidence so strongly suggested, that Miss Marple found herself explaining, in the small sitting-room Mrs. Trent had lent them for the purpose, precisely why she had suspected the butler before ever the twine was found. "You must understand, Inspector, that I have lived the whole of my life in a very small village, and people are, in the essentials, very much the same in a village as in a great house of this kind, whatever the difference in their china and their notepaper. I was reminded, almost from the first, of a man in St. Mary Mead, I shall not trouble you with his name, who kept the accounts for our local bowls club for a great many years, and was universally trusted to do so, precisely because no one had ever once thought to check his sums, until a new treasurer arrived who did check them, and a very unpleasant business it turned out to be. What struck me about that gentleman, and what has struck me about Simmons from the moment I first heard Mrs. Trent describe the trouble over the cellar accounts, is that a man who has built his whole character, over many years, on being the one person no one need ever verify, comes to depend upon that reputation very much as another man might depend upon his savings. Take it from him, expose the sums, produce a witness from his past, and you have not merely embarrassed him, you have removed the entire foundation upon which he has stood for 18 years. Such a man does not reason as you or I might reason, Inspector, weighing a small deception against a large risk. He reasons as a man defending the only thing of value he possesses, and the flour, and the twine, and the rest of it. You saw all that as confirming what you'd already reasoned about the man himself. I saw it as confirming that the means existed to match the motive I already suspected, which is not quite the same thing, but is, I think, how one generally arrives at the truth in these matters. One half of the picture from watching people, and the other half from watching the physical world they have left their fingerprints upon, if you will forgive so grand a phrase for flower and garden twine. Mrs. Coombs, you see, was a woman who prided herself on knowing where everybody was buried in that house, if I may borrow her own unhappy choice of words, and Simmons was a man whose entire position depended upon no one ever digging any of them up. When Ivy Coombs began asking about his sums, and Rose Tranter walked back into the house under another woman's name with an old grievance 15 years unpaid, I think Simmons understood, better than either of those two women themselves understood it, that he was standing at the edge of exposure on two sides at once. And I do not think, Inspector, that he ever intended to harm Mrs. Vane at all. I think Ivy Coombs alone was the more pressing danger, because she alone had proof, in his own ledger, and had said as much to the Colonel already. And the business of locking the pantry from outside, implicating the girl, I think that was less a plan than an opportunity seized in the moment, Inspector. Simmons knew the household routine intimately enough to know that Dolly Pike had been seen about the linen room at odd hours before, and that suspicion, if it fell anywhere at all, would fall most naturally upon a scullery maid already under a cloud for keeping company above her station, rather than upon a butler of 18 years' unblemished service, going about his nightly rounds precisely as he did every night of his life. It is, I think, the oldest trick in the world, Inspector, and none the less effective for being old. A guilty man borrowing the shape of an existing suspicion, rather than inventing a new one, because a suspicion already half-formed in everyone's mind requires so very much less persuading. Foley sat for a moment turning this over, and then said, with the frankness of a man who has decided he need no longer pretend to more expertise than he possesses, "I'll own, Miss Marple, that I've conducted a good many inquiries in my time, and I've generally relied on fingerprints and footprints and the like to tell me who did what, and left it to the magistrates to worry over why. I can't say I've had much cause before now to sit and listen to a lady explain a murderer to me by way of a bowls club treasurer in a village I've never visited. But I don't mind telling you, it makes a deal more sense of the physical evidence than anything Prentice managed to make of it. That is only, Inspector, because Constable Prentice was looking at a staircase and a body, and had not yet had the opportunity to look at 18 years of a man's character, Miss Marple said. The two inquiries want rather different sorts of patience, and I have had, over the years, a good deal more practice at the second kind than most policemen are given leave to acquire. Chapter 11. The Trap. Inspector Foley, having examined the twine and found upon it precisely the fibres Miss Marple had predicted, together with a faint but analysable trace of the pantry bolt's iron upon the loop, agreed that the moment had come to confront Simmons, but agreed also, after some persuasion on Miss Marple's part, that a direct accusation, however soundly supported by evidence, was less likely to produce a full account of the matter than a confrontation that allowed the man to see, gradually and inescapably, precisely how much was known. It was arranged, therefore, that the household should be gathered that evening in the drawing-room, ostensibly for Inspector Foley to deliver a formal update on the closing of the inquiry. A piece of stage management Miss Marple approved of entirely, having a great fondness, developed over many years of village life, for occasions on which everyone believed themselves to be present merely as spectators. The room, when the family assembled, wore a curious echo of the retirement tea held there scarcely a fortnight before, the same chairs arranged in very nearly the same places, the same low fire in the grate. And Miss Marple, taking a seat a little apart from the others by the window, thought it a melancholy thing that a room could so faithfully reproduce the outward shape of an occasion, while its whole inward meaning had, in the space of 2 weeks, been so entirely and irrevocably altered. Colonel Ashworth stood by the mantel as he had stood before, though his hand upon it now looked less a gesture of ease than one of support. Gerald sat beside Dolly Pike, with a boldness that would have been unthinkable a fortnight earlier, her hand held quite openly in his, and Mrs. Vane sat a little apart, pale but composed, no longer troubling to maintain the correct county voice that had served her so poorly. Simmons himself, summoned to attend upon the family as was proper, stood by the door in his usual attitude of smooth, unhurried readiness, and it was to him, rather than to the assembled Ashworths, that Inspector Foley addressed his first remarks. We've been able to establish, since our earlier inquiries, a few points that want clearing up, Foley said, in the flat, unemphatic tone of a man reading from notes, rather than pressing an accusation. The pantry bolt, for one, thrown from the outside, we now believe, through the window above the flour bin. A window, we're told, was left ajar most nights for ventilation. Whoever did it used a length of garden twine, looped over the bolt handle. We found the twine this afternoon, Simmons, in the shed, in the drawer where you keep the kitchen garden stores. Simmons did not move, but something in the smoothness of him, Miss Marple, watching closely, thought of a pond upon which the first small stone has just broken an apparently unbroken surface, altered by some fraction too small to name. A great many people have access to that shed, Inspector, he said, his voice as level as ever. I could not answer for what may or may not be found in a drawer used by the gardener and his boy alike. No, Foley agreed pleasantly, except that the twine matches, fibre for fibre, a trace we've lifted off the bolt itself, and except that Mrs. Coombs, the week before she died, told the Colonel she meant to have a word with you about the wine merchant's account, which we've now had independently checked and find some 4 years' worth of small but regular discrepancies, every one of them, Simmons, running in your favour. And except, Foley went on, in the same level tone, though Miss Marple saw Colonel Ashworth's face whiten as the words landed, that a Hampshire constabulary has this week confirmed, at Miss Marple's suggestion, a theft of household silver some 15 years back, for which an under-parlourmaid named Rose Tranter was dismissed without a character. A theft the under-butler of that same household was never once questioned about, though he left his position within the month, and turns out, on the records, to have been one Arthur Simmons. Simmons's eyes went, for the first time that evening, to Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the window, with her hands folded upon her handbag, and something in his face, recognition perhaps, of the particular danger a mild-mannered old lady with a talent for noticing things could represent to a man who had spent 18 years relying on precisely such people to notice nothing at all, passed across it like a shadow. "You," he said, very low. "It was you who set all this in motion. An old woman come for tea. I came for tea, Mr. Simmons, and I stayed, I confess, for a good deal more than that. Once I understood there was a death in this house that wanted looking at rather more closely than a constable in a hurry had troubled to look at it," Miss Marple said, without heat. "I do not think you would have been caught at all, had you been content to let one threat pass and manage the other by more patient means. It was greed for safety on both fronts at once, I think, that undid you, the wish to be entirely secure, when a wiser man might have settled for being merely safe enough." It was at this point, with Mrs. Vane rising white-faced from her chair, and Dolly Pike's hand flying to her mouth, and Colonel Ashworth setting down his glass with a crack that made Mrs. Trent jump, that Simmons's long-cultivated smoothness broke at last, all at once, like ice giving way beneath a weight it had borne, apparently without strain, for a very great many years, and he said, in a voice quite unlike the one he had used for 18 years of unimpeachable service, "She would have ruined me. Both of them would have ruined me, and neither one of them for a moment thought what it would mean. 30 years I served, and 18 more here, and I was to lose it all for a few pounds on a wine account, and a girl's dismissal 15 years gone that was never even proved." "It was never proved, Simmons," Miss Marple said quietly, from her chair by the window, "because Rose Tranter was never given the chance to prove her innocence at all. You saw to that very thoroughly, I think, 15 years ago, a good deal more thoroughly, in the end, than you managed to see to it this time." Chapter 12. The Whisper Explained. There is a particular silence Miss Marple had observed on more than one such occasion in her life, that falls over a room in the instant a respectable man's facade gives way entirely. Not the shocked murmur of surprise, for by then no one present is truly surprised, but something quieter and more sobering. The silence of people watching a shape they had trusted, without ever quite examining why, dissolve into something they must now learn to see plainly. It was in just such a silence that Simmons, seated now rather than standing, his 18 years of upright service gone out of him like air from a punctured bladder, began at last to speak. He talked in the end a good deal more than Inspector Foley had strictly needed him to, in the manner Miss Marple had observed in a good many people over the years, once the first admission had broken the dam behind which a long secret had been held, as though the telling itself were a relief no longer worth denying himself, whatever the consequence. He had gone to Ivy Coombs's room, he said, that night, on the pretext of discussing a household matter, and persuaded her, she had no great liking for him, but no great suspicion either, not yet, not enough to refuse a butler's request out of hand, to come up with him to the box-room at the top of the back stairs, on some invented errand concerning boxes to be sent down for the jumble sale Mrs. Trent's retirement had occasioned. It was there, on the narrow half-landing, in the dark, that he had struck her. Not, he insisted, with any weapon, only with his own hands, in a moment of panic rather than calculation, when she had turned on him with the accusation about the wine account fully formed and furious upon her lips, and had then, in the true calculation that followed the panic, carried her down and arranged her at the foot of the servants' stairs where a fall might plausibly have occurred, scattering, in his haste, some of the flour she had been carrying up for the jumble sales cake stall, never dreaming that a trail of white dust 2 floors above the pantry would mean anything at all to anyone. The pantry bolt had been a colder, more deliberate thing entirely, done afterward, on his ordinary rounds, when he had reasoned, with the terrible clarity of a man improvising a defense, that a locked room might lend the whole business an air of accident too complete to question, and that if suspicion fell anywhere at all, it would fall upon a scullery maid already known to keep to the upper floors at unlikely hours, rather than upon himself. He described, in a flat, exhausted voice, quite unlike his old smoothness, how he had lain awake 3 nights running before he acted, turning the problem over as though it were nothing more than a difficult column of figures that must, somehow, be made to balance, and how on the 4th night, with the Colonel's whiskey-flushed remark about checking the cellar accounts still ringing in his ears from dinner, he had gone to Ivy Coombs's door telling himself he meant only to talk her round, to explain the discrepancy as a clerical error, to buy, if nothing else, a few days' grace in which to think of something better. "I never meant Mrs. Vane the smallest harm," he said, near the end, when Foley's men had come to take him, and the drawing-room stood in the particular hush of a house that has just watched something irreversible occur within its own walls. "I meant only to buy her silence, given time, as I have bought a good many silences over a good many years. It was Ivy Coombs alone I could not manage, because she alone had proof, and she alone had already spoken to the Colonel of it, and there was no silencing a thing already half out of the bag. When it was over, and the house had begun, in the slow, awkward way of households recovering from catastrophe, to reassemble itself around its altered shape, Mrs. Trent walked with Miss Marple to the gate, in the mild grey light of a morning that felt, after so much darkness, almost apologetically ordinary. "I said to you once, Jane, that 30 years was a long time to watch people not say what they mean," she said. "I didn't think, when I said it, that I was watching a murderer manage his sums." "No one ever does think it, Enid, until it is proved to them," Miss Marple said. "That is rather the trouble with murder in a house like this one. Everybody is so occupied watching the small deceptions, the little vanities and grudges and secret engagements, that they forget a man may be capable of building the largest deception of all directly beneath their notice, out of nothing more remarkable than 18 years of never once being asked to account for himself. It is, if you will forgive the comparison, very like a garden left too long unweeded, Enid. One assumes, because nothing troublesome has shown itself above the soil for a very long time, that nothing troublesome is growing there at all, until the one week someone finally troubles to dig. Dolly Pike, it transpired within the month, married her Gerald after all, the Colonel having discovered, in the aftermath of so much larger a scandal, that a housemaid's honest affection weighed rather lighter in the balance of family disgrace than he had once supposed. And Mrs. Vane, Rose Tranter, as she had once again begun to call herself, having no further reason to hide behind another woman's name, left Gossington Manor at last, with the small, hard-won satisfaction of a 15-year-old injustice, publicly, if belatedly, undone. Miss Marple, taking the bus back to St. Mary Mead that afternoon with her gloves neatly folded in her lap, reflected only that Enid Trent's retirement tea had, after all, told her everything she needed to know, in the ordinary small currency of a single sideways glance across a plate of seed cake, and that villages, whether they called themselves St. Mary Mead or Gossington Manor, kept their secrets in remarkably similar places, for those with the patience to notice where the flower had fallen.